Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
And today we're really excited to welcome one of my favorite YouTubers and transit experts, Reece Martin, who runs the channel RM Transit. So thank you so much for joining us, Reece.
Thanks for having me on.
One of the biggest expenses for people is, of course, the cost of owning a car. And we know that the main way to get around having to pay for a car is if there's solid, reliable transit available. So we feel like it's a really important topic. Is there anywhere in Canada right now that's doing transit well?
There are places that are doing all right. In Vancouver and in Montreal, they're still managing to build some projects pretty effectively. But even in those places, they've really declined in their ability to deliver projects. And in the place where we're spending the most money on transit in Toronto, where we are spending a truly astronomical amount of money on new transit projects, our ability to build stuff has just declined precipitously in the last decade, but it's just kind of been a continuous decline for decades and decades.
You mentioned that it's becoming harder and harder to build. Like, why is that happening?
We have had, as you go through building transit projects, sometimes they go well, sometimes they go poorly. And usually after something doesn't go the way you hope it goes, you implement some reforms and hope that those reforms lead to you doing things better. And we have managed to implement a lot of reforms that have moved us in a negative direction. And I think
what kinds of reforms?
Well, all kinds of things. So we have really gutted the public sector's ability to deliver transit projects. Historically, the public sector did a lot of the engineering and planning work for transit projects. And this isn't the only problem, but it's certainly one of the biggest ones. And kind of the belief has been over the years that, the public sector is getting worse at delivering projects, so we should invite the private sector to do more. And, with any reform, you could have a positive change or a negative change, but we seem to have forgotten that there's such thing as negative learning. You can learn a bad thing that makes you worse at something. And I think that's what's really happened with building big transit projects. And a lot of the same things apply to other infrastructure projects in Canada.
Yeah, Mike, I was thinking you might want to add something to that, because I'm sure that when you're hearing about us learning negative things, learning negative habits, it probably translates to other areas, right?
Well, first, Reece, thanks for coming on. And as a resident of Ottawa, I got to ask, what should we be learning from the Ottawa LRT situation?
I mean, I think the Ottawa LRT is a case of many layers of problems that have all compounded on one another. This idea of converting a busway to a rail line was untested, and that should always be the first red flag. Are you doing something that they don't do in other places? Because even if it's going to work, you're taking a risk in doing that. There were the technologies that were chosen. The city of Ottawa was advised against kind of light rail because they were trying to do a lot of things with it at once. They're trying to provide a subway style service essentially with light rail. And so there's a technology mismatch. There's the big P3. And P3s aren't necessarily novel, but that's more risk.
For those who don't know, can you just describe what a P3 is?
Mike, do you want to?
Well, P3 is basically a private-public partnership, where, at least in theory, that the government, the public partner, can outsource some of these responsibilities to the private partner and reduce risk. It tends to seem to work better in theory than in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ultimate problem is that there's no free lunch, so you don't get anything for free. So even if you do transfer the risk, you're paying to transfer the risk, and so you pay with a higher price up front. But then it gets into a different challenge, which is now you have this kind of legal and contractual dance you're doing with the private sector, and the question is, are their lawyers better than your lawyers? And if they are, then they're probably getting a much better deal than the public is getting, right? And so that's a big problem with it. And we have had P3s go actually pretty well in Canada as far as P3s go for transit. But, in Ontario, they're not going well. And, on balance, when you look at places internationally that have done P3s, Seoul is a good example. Seoul is one of the best cities in the world at building public transit. They did one P3, like a transit P3, and they haven't done any more after that transit P3. And you generally see that cities that are good at building transit have sometimes dabbled in P3s, and they usually go back to doing it the good old-fashioned way.
I know they have a pretty good transit system there, and I remember going there around 10 years ago and being able to use my phone on the subway, and I was like, this is magical, and it took us a decade to get there in Toronto. It's a very new thing, and it's exciting, and it feels safer, but also I keep being like, yeah, they had it a long time ago. It just takes us so long to do anything. I know from watching your channel, I've learned that like other places build subways for something like it costs us about 3 times as much, 2 or 3 times as much, depending on the project. Is that right?
It's at the worst end, it's like 10 times as much as much money. So I have something, I've pulled the document up that's really good that I can send it across at some point. But it's essentially, there's this great report that was done by this journalist, Stephen Wickens, for the RCCAO. It's like an organization of civil engineers. And what he did was he looked at the inflation-adjusted costs of subways in Toronto. And, we like to say globally right now, the median cost for a subway in the best countries, the countries that are the most cost-effective, like Korea, Spain, Italy, these are developed countries. Accessibility is a requirement. There's unionized workers and everything. They build for 100 to 200 million per kilometer, which was actually historically roughly what Toronto did as well. And now, though, with the projects we're building, we're pushing $1 billion per kilometer, which is similar to New York and London, the highest costs in the world.
What changed?
So a lot of things have changed. We used to basically use an organization like the TTC would do engineering and planning work, and they took the project a lot further along before the private sector got involved. And the private sector has always been involved in transit projects because the government doesn't own the shovels, right? Like some private companies have to come in and build the thing. But we used to do the engineering and planning work, which has become a huge part of the cost. But traditionally, drawing up the plans wasn't actually a huge element of the cost. It was actually fairly minor. You're not digging, you're not blowing holes in buildings and stuff. And we've taken that and we've privatized it essentially. Like we farm it out to consultants, and when even just doing that is a huge increase in cost because there's a profit that has to be made on top of the work that's being done, and there's been an atrophying of the experts within the public sector that used to be able to deliver these projects, and so that's probably the single biggest thing. On top of the fact that cost is an issue that exists and it's huge, but no one seems very bothered by it. We seem like we're going to just accept that projects are going to cost more and more, but what that means is we're going to get less and less built. And when you look at places like London and New York, these are huge cities. They're still growing. They're economic powerhouses, and they've built almost nothing in the last several decades.
It's so wild to think about. And I know that I've heard that NIMBYism plays a role in this as well. I know that we talk about that a lot when it comes to housing, but I've heard that it's almost as much of a factor when it comes to building transit. Can you describe where NIMBYism stops transit from being built up more efficiently and affordably?
I mean, I think as with housing, there's a lot of veto potential in different places. If you look at the Ontario line, for example,
that's in downtown Toronto.
Yeah, the downtown relief line, essentially, like it's meant to connect between line 2 and line 1 of the subway. It goes through the East End, and the line was meant to be cost effective, which is part of why it's so disturbing that it costs more than anything we've ever built before, and possibly is the most expensive subway ever constructed anywhere.
Wow.
It's meant to be cost effective. So parts of it go above ground, which is kind of obvious that would be less expensive. You're not tunneling, you're not doing the complex utility relocations, et cetera. But then people have to see the transit that they will ride. And many people, even those living next to existing rail corridors and road corridors, they're not, happy with that. And so there's a lot of kind of payouts and capitulation that has to happen, various mitigation measures, et cetera, that wouldn't be standard around the world, like sound walls, which Metrolinx spends enormous amounts of money on to protect residents from the sound of electric trains, which are typically quieter than road traffic. And so there's a lot of these kind of measures that get made. And then there's kind of capitulation to the cities and regions where you see operation happening. So you'd think that Metrolinx, being an arm of the government of Ontario, would have this kind of ultimate authority to make decisions. But a lot of stuff is still dependent on the city. And so when you look at some of these parts of the Ontario line, for example, they're reliant on the city to give them plans for things and where are the utilities. And the city might say, we won't give you this if you don't do this, if you don't capitulate on this thing. And so you see that there's no ultimate authority, and there's a lot of battling back and forth. Sometimes this is called kind of the other people's money problem. And so what happens is when the city or a utility or a homeowner sees that there's a project that has a ton of money, they see it as, how can I extract things? Because this is probably going to get built, and what can I ask for? That it isn't necessary, but government is rarely going to say no, and Metrolinx hasn't been very good at saying no to a lot of things. And so it's like, how can we build a new path here or a new park here? And these things are good in isolation, but they become the cost of building transit and infrastructure that we need. And so it might be the same with the utilities. Maybe Bell should move this fiber optic cable. I'm using this purely as an example. May or may not have happened. And instead of Bell paying for it, it might be, oh, well, that's the cost of building a subway. So you're going to pay for it, and you're going to pay to upgrade our equipment at the same time for the privilege of relocating stuff. And so it's kind of just this pipeline of so many different places where costs can increase, and we haven't made a low cost and fast delivery of projects a priority. And that speed is a huge thing too, because when so many of your costs are the soft things, the consultants and the engineering and planning, the more time you spend building something, the more hours that are going to get billed, and the higher the cost gets.
Mike?
So there's the cost side. I'm curious about the revenue side as well. I've gone all over the world, and you go to a lot of subway stations or train stations or so on, and there's a lot of integrated office space, residential space, retail space, and so on that can be used to offset some of those costs. But I look here in Ottawa, our LRT stations are completely self-contained. You look at the GO station. We built a GO station in the middle of the green belts, with nothing around it. Are there
and no potential for anything around it?
Yeah, well, because you can't build anything around it. Are there any transit authorities in Canada that are doing these kind of integrated things to raise revenues? Because it seems to me that you're kind of upzoning all this area around it. You're creating all of this land value near these stations that ends up getting captured by private industry rather than by the transit company who's generating all the value in the first place.
Not a lot. There is a small amount of that going on. So Vancouver, for example, is actually starting to dabble in this, doing their own developments and capturing some of the profits. It especially makes sense for the transit companies because they have to accumulate a lot of land when they do construction. Often it's not even for building the thing, but for parking trucks and construction equipment. So after they have the land, why not develop on it and use that to fund expansion? So there's been very little. There is a bit happening with the Ontario line now, and Metrolinx is kind of trying to get involved in that, but it's parceled out and it's not very organized. And so the development portion happens with Infrastructure Ontario. And I don't think we've gotten to a point where we can determine whether it has been a net positive or not. But there are certainly higher costs that you have to bear when you do a development on top of a transit station. You've got to build a tougher station with deeper foundations and everything. And so you already have to ask, if a different agency is responsible for the kind of profit side, the revenue side, in this case, Infrastructure Ontario, is there any connection? Is there any consideration of how much cost do we have to actually recover to make this worth it? How can we design things and so that cost recovery is possible? And so I think that our model is not so integrated, and it's unlikely to be super successful. The example people love to bring up is Hong Kong, where they do manage to actually, they make a profit on operations, even without considering land holdings and stuff. But when they do things, it's a very integrated approach. So when they're planning the station, they're thinking about, is there going to be a parkade or a loading dock in the building? And how do we integrate the structures? And the engineers are talking to each other. in the kind of current Toronto approach, we build this parceled off station, which has a very strong roof on it, and then we hand it off to someone else to try to, sell it to developers. And developers often aren't that interested because, having to build a building on top of a station means having to work with Metrolinx. And if you don't know, you might not know, when are you going to get the site? When can you build? If you think of the Eglinton Crosstown, imagine you bought a parcel on top of one of the stations. A couple of them actually do have the capability, but it's still not running. You might not have the site still. You might be sitting on this expensive investment for 5 years, 6 years. And so it's a very unattractive situation for private developers. And I think there's just a lot of left hand and right hand don't even talk. Like, as you guys know, we plan stuff so that, a lot of around the subways is still low density housing. And we even plan things so that it's tapering off around the station so we don't irritate the local homeowners, when inevitably in 20 years, it probably will be, high density. And so there's so many problems when it comes to development and transit.
Yeah, I think about that in the Yonge Street extension. And I know that instead of just going straight up Yonge Street, they're kind of like making this weird detour to go off to the side and then come back. And like that, how much does that add to the project? That kind of detour, just to keep it away from being underneath people's homes?
It's supposed to be, so the idea of it is actually that it's going to save money because it's going to be above ground at the very northern end. But if you kind of look at the map, they have to travel almost as far to get over to the above ground corridor as they would if they just went straight north. And so I think that highlights a lot of what you see. It's the same with the development. There's a lot of performative stuff where we're trying to save costs by doing this thing, or we're trying to make it so you can develop on top of buildings or on top of our stations. But you kind of question whether the outcome is actually happening. With regard to those sites, there is going to be massive development. And so maybe that will recover some of the cost. But it's been super controversial because the amount of density we're putting in those locations is absolutely astronomical. And the Yonge subway doesn't have a ton of capacity anyways. And so it seems like another place where we're putting all this development in a place where there isn't actually the capacity to handle it on the transit. And again, there's this misalignment, and this land use and transportation have certainly not come together. And you can see that downtown, where we have all these condos in places where there's no rapid transit.
How do we make it less performative?
I mean, I think that it would require political interest in the issue of costs and the effectiveness and delivery of projects. And ultimately, how much have we heard about the fact that the Eglinton Crosstown has taken 13 years to be completed and is way over budget and has been so disastrous? We've heard very little, and there's been very little accountability or even discussion of how we're going to avoid the same problems in the future. I think some of those things are happening, but only behind the scenes. And so I think for it to become less performative, there needs to be a level of transparency. And when it comes to transit, this applies to a lot of things in Canada, there is a shocking level of opaqueness in everything. I talk to a lot of people from Italy because Italy is the most effective place in Europe at building, high-speed rail and rapid transit today. Everything is public in Italy. And when they see the way that things operate in Canada, and they do P3s and they do all of the, privatized design and stuff for some projects, everything is public. The public can see how much the government is paying for concrete, how much they're paying for everything, because Italy, there's a history of corruption. And so when they see the way that we operate, they imagine it must be illegal that we would be doing things this way, because you can't find out any information, and the government probably doesn't even know a lot of these things because there's very little internal transparency as well. And so there's many, many avenues we need to approach this problem from.
Yeah, so here's I'm kind of caught up on this cost area. That it seems to me that we tend to build transit, and this could be within cities or between cities, that we allow the cities to build up first, then we build the transit, kind of inconveniencing everyone and making things more expensive. Is that just kind of a North America thing? I hear, in China, it's more the opposite, that the transit comes first and the housing around it. Would doing things differently, building the transit first, is there a certain logic to that, and would that reduce costs?
That's definitely one thing that we can do. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the only thing, but it's certainly a huge thing. And you're right that there are so many cases where we've built massive new development areas like Humber Bay Shores in Toronto or the Portlands in Toronto. These are huge development areas, and people will move in and the transit won't be there, and so they'll buy a car and get used to driving. And so there's the whole transit use problem. But there is a cost problem as well. Like, as you highlight, once people are already there, there's more disruption to worry about. There's more safety measures, et cetera, that have to be dealt with. You can't be driving dump trucks around everywhere and doing all the construction work. And so when you look at development internationally in places like Spain and Italy, where it's low cost, as well as China, which is actually not as cost effective as the European countries, surprisingly, what you'll see is they will put the transit in and the development will follow shortly after. And usually they'll bury the transit because when you're talking about an open field, the cost of building a tunnel is the cost of digging a trench and burying it, like they used to do in so many traditional rapid transit systems. And so it's absolutely a factor, trying to actually choose corridors and choose places where we can build stuff. And you aren't going around a super old infrastructure and where people are living, because that does inevitably lead to, cost explosion. You see a bit of this in Metro Vancouver, where they have, built transit and then a lot of the development fills in afterwards. They often use, a lot of commercial sites like malls, et cetera. And so there are examples of that in Canada, but in Toronto, we've waited so long to build transit that the low-hanging fruit has often been kind of picked already.
I feel like that could never pass politically, because people would say, well, why are we building transit out to this area when this part that's actually already has people living there isn't actually being well served? Like, do you need to have it where some people are well served already, where everyone's at least decently served before you expand and build something brand new? Or do you think that there's political will for that?
I mean, I think that it's a question of, really being forward thinking and being able to enjoy the shade of a tree that, that you plant versus never being able to enjoy it. I mean, when you look at the most famous images of rapid transit, I think the one that comes to mind for me is the Queens Boulevard line in New York, where it's this elevated train line going out into empty fields. And, that is, a white elephant. But the most successful projects we've typically ever built are the projects where we were so forward thinking and we built something that seemed excessive at the time. The issue is it is totally politically unacceptable, right? Like, you think of the subway extension to York University. It was really expensive and it was politically contentious. And that's a big part of why we've done this huge shift to P3s, because, the TTC went way over budget, et cetera. But now that it's built, it's going to be there for 100 years. We have all of this time to recover benefits from it, but all we see is the cost and the overrun. And I think that there's a lot of, kind of political expediency in trying to avoid that negative press, right? And it's the same with the costs. It seems really bad to go over budget if your budget, irrespective of what your budget is, but coming in under budget, but then having a much higher initial budget, it's seen as actually okay. And so what you'll often see is that our costs go up, but now we might deliver projects on budget or below budget. But there's no consideration of like, oh, but now you're building for 5 times more money. So we actually didn't achieve anything. You just, made it more politically popular to build something.
Yeah, I hope people listening to this kind of come away with the understanding that we could build subways for like 5 subways for the price of 1 if we just fix the way we're doing something like that. That would be huge. I think I see these people posting online sometimes like these, like the fantasy maps of what the Toronto subway could look like, or whatever, pick a city in Canada, what they could actually look like if we actually built it properly, and how exciting that would be. And I hope people understand that that's like actually possible. But one thing that I really like about you is that you seem to have some optimism for the future of Canada, despite all the complaints that we're talking about right now and all the issues. What kind of keeps your optimism up?
I mean, I think the good thing is that we are building so much public transportation. And I really think that, rapid transit in particular, subways, regional trains, all of this, they really beget more rapid transit. When you get people on board and it's faster than driving, it creates enormous economic benefit, but it also creates a constituency of people who get it. And I think the reason that a city like Vancouver has been on such a better trajectory than Toronto is that they got people on board. They showed that, this was a good idea to build out transit. and they've kept building. And that's a huge, key component. A big part of the problems in so much of Canada, Toronto and Montreal, is that there was this period of stagnation in the, late 20th century where nothing was getting built. And so the people who were experienced in the public sector headed to greener pastures where they were building things. And so that's a big reason why knowledge atrophies and why you aren't able to kind of incrementally improve. And so the good thing is that in Toronto in particular, we're building a lot of projects now. And that means that you have this project. Can we do better on the next one? How do we get lower cost? People actually build up a sense of expertise for building transit projects that didn't exist when no transit projects were being built. And so what I hope is going to happen is that we build and the demand for transit goes up, and we kind of have a discussion and say we can keep building, but we have to get better at building at the same time. And so I think that you can't have, you don't want to end up like Chicago or New York or Philadelphia. These are big cities that, are building zero. And so even if they wanted to build, how would they, who would they be able to call on? And so when they try to deliver projects, they're extremely expensive, like Toronto's, but they don't, continue. They don't build the pipeline. And so they have no hope of getting more effective at building stuff. At least in Canada, we're funding transit, we are funding the process, and we have a pathway. The question is whether we'll take the pathway to getting better at this stuff so that we can keep building transit, far into the future.
Well, just one final question for you. So we focus a lot on LRTs and subways and things like that. And I'm somebody who has to travel a lot between Ottawa and London, Ontario. Are we ever going to see better transit options, rail options,
high-speed
and
rail.
so on?
Yeah,
high-speed rail or high-frequency rail or what have you. Is that going to happen, and what would it take?
I mean, I think that the thing that's so interesting is the exact same problems that exist for urban transit basically exist for high-speed rail. But the thing is that high-speed rail, even though it has become really common now, like it's in Indonesia and Uzbekistan and India and Morocco, like so many places, it's still much less common than a light rail line or a subway. And so there's still more risk in building it. Ultimately, will we have it? I think we should. I mean, our economy is big enough. Our density is high enough. Every other G7 country has high-speed rail. Pretty soon, every other G20 country will have high-speed rail. And so I think we can have it, but we do have to have the exact same conversations about how do we have the expertise in government to build these things, because farming it out to the private sector means extremely expensive projects. And, expensive projects, you could just look at California high-speed rail or HS2 in the UK. At best, they will muddle along, and it will take us a century to get something built that actually connects large urban centers. And at worst, they'll get cut back, and political support will dry up because it is a white elephant that isn't going to eventually do something useful. And so I think the issue ultimately is one of having a vision that we need to build this thing, like so many countries in other parts of the world did. But we also have to want to do it. Like have to want the process to work and want to do it at reasonable prices. And so that probably means, importing expertise from internationally. When you look at a country like Korea, for example, they got all of their initial high-speed rail expertise from France. They bought a lot of the trains from France. They did the engineering works based on the French standards. They got that knowledge. They trained up their local engineering, industry, and now they're able to build stuff the Korean way, which is, is diverged from how the French do things. And so I think ultimately it's a combination of funding and political will and the actual willpower to build projects better so that we can achieve large things and not just kind of throw money around, which inevitably leads to cost blowouts and consultants come running because there's money flowing, but that doesn't lead to things getting built.
I hope that if there's any policymakers listening that you consult with Reece, because he seems to know so much about this and how to make it better. And I feel like if we just, hopefully someone is listening who can actually make these changes and we can see some improvements in transit sometime in my lifetime would be great. I'd love to see the LRT open sometime in the next decade. That'd be great. The Eglinton one, I lived near there for almost 10 years and I expected to be able to use it, and I've moved away and have never been able to use it, and who knows when it's going to actually open. There's no credible opening date, I think is what they keep saying still. A credible plan to finish it. But thank you so much for joining us and giving us like a much better understanding about it. We really appreciate your time.
Happy to, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Yeah, I learned a lot, and that was fantastic. And hopefully, as Cara says, we can start to see this sometime in our lifetimes.
Thank you so much for watching and listening, and thanks as always to our producer, Meredith Martin.
And please like, subscribe, or leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
And we'll see you next time.